The dropper post is one of the best things on the bike in terms of giving you confidence when descending. But then again, so is front and rear suspension, but in a completely different way. So what then makes more difference in terms of giving you confidence and speed when descending on rough ground? A rigid bike equipped with a dropper post, or a full suspension bike with a rigid seat post? Let's find out, shall we? Now, in case it's not obvious, I literally love everything about mountain bike technology. Carbon, alloy, 27.5-inch wheels, 29-inch wheels, tubeless, hydraulic disc brakes, full suspension that's adjustable, coil suspension, air suspension, electronic dropper post, literally you name it, I love it. But more than a few times on the channel, I've actually commented saying I think that the dropper post makes more of a significant difference in terms of the benefits that you can get when handling off-road, mainly because you can get the bike out the way between your legs and you can move around using your entire body for suspension. And I've basically said I thought I could ride one of those a bit better than another setup. And quite a few people called me out on it. So, well, today, that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to be riding two similar, yet very different bikes. So let's have a look at the bikes and we'll explain what we're going to be doing. Now, this bike here is an Ooyy Alma. It's a cross-country bike. It's completely rigid. I would say it's a super bike. It's incredibly light. It's around 20 pounds in weight, and it's equipped with a dropper post. Okay, so that dropper post enables me to get the saddle out the way. The bike can ricochet around underneath me, hopefully, and enabling me to ride with nice control. And then the other bike is a Canyon Lux. Now, this one is a Lux Trail. It's got 110 millimeters of travel at the back, 120 at the front, and it's a very lightweight bike, although it's probably 5 or 6 pounds heavier than the Ooyy there. Now, a few of you will notice that I've got a dropper post on here, but because this one is a reverb dropper post and it's an access one, all I've got to do is take the battery off the back here by flicking this little lever. I could just leave it on the floor, or I could give it to the cameraman, and it effectively becomes a rigid seat post. That's also a really nice, cool trick you can play to your friends that's got one of those before they tackle a downhill. Now, we're going to do a bunch of different things out on the trail to demonstrate what is good about the two different setups and where you can get advantages. Now, which one should I ride first? What do you reckon, Louis? Okay, full sus it is. Let's go, shall we? So there's already a couple of observations I'd completely forgotten about. So I grew up riding rigid bikes with no dropper posts, and coming somewhere like this, you put the saddle down a little bit just to get it out of the way. And what you forget when your saddle's up totally affects the position on the bike. So once you get a hang of it, you can start getting behind the saddle, which is good to get out of the way, but it's not necessarily the correct riding position. Being neutral on the bike is always going to be the best, and being low is the best, which with the saddle up makes it so difficult, especially when you're tall like me, because your height is so high up. You feel like a pendulum. Even the slightest bump feels like it's going to push you forwards on the bike. The way it covers ground, look at this, so smooth across the ground. So as soon as you get to features, oh my God, you're at the absolute mercy. I am 100% relying on the suspensions to save me. Now, what I'm discovering on here is I'm using all of my suspension travel, riding a really basic section of trail here at what I think's a mediocre speed. The saddle was kicking me the whole time. And ironically, because the bike, so this is a Lux Trail, it's a little bit longer than some cross-country bikes. So I'm running a 50mm stem on here. Normally on cross-country bikes, in my sort of size, I'm running like 80, sometimes a 90mm stem like I am on the Ooyy. Because that extra length, it makes it even harder to get off the back of the saddle. So on bikes of old that were rigid with no suspension, no drop posts, the saddle will be hitting you in the chest because you're going off the back of the saddle. I'm finding it really difficult to even get in that position. This is where it doesn't feel especially nice with that saddle up. Whoa! Rigid bike, dropper post. This is pretty flipping bumpy along here. Oh my God. Oh my balls. I just ball checked the back of the saddle. I'd completely forgotten, to be honest, just how chattery a completely rigid bike is. Obviously, there's nowhere for the bumps to go other than your tyres. They come straight through to you. Even the smallest little jump, that felt like I did a massive jump. Look at the size of it, it's only about that big. Speed though, don't think I've got it on this one. Making all sorts of weird noises up here. Oh my God. God. Absolutely horrific. I feel like I got a bit of neck trauma after that. You're tensing so hard to try and stay in one piece. I mean, admittedly, this isn't a cross-country trail. This trail is closed, by the way, in case you wonder why I'm walking up it, so we're okay for filming. This trail is actually a bit more of an enduro style trail, so it's kind of a little bit unfair on the rigid bike on here, but say it again, the saddle position you can achieve with a dropper post whilst riding is you can obviously lower your saddle with an Allen key or quick release, but the ability to lower it and raise it as you're riding changes everything. I said for a long time, geometry and riding position are the two biggest things, like bike fit basically, the two biggest things in terms of performance on a bike. Everything else comes along for the ride, and yes, everything else will enhance your ride and enable you to do other things, but I'm like blown away by how comfortable, even though it's painful, it feels like I can ride this trail. Yeah, I was riding the bike with full suspension on the same trail and I felt so restricted by it. And of course you would dial in either way, you know. I used to ride a rigid bike with the saddle up and got used to that. So, but obviously for this comparison, I'm not used to a suspension bike with a high post and I'm not used to a rigid bike at all either. So pretty realistic. I've got to say, I'm not looking forward to getting back on a full suspension bike though. Even though it's by far quicker on rough ground, as soon as there's proper lumps and bumps and drops and things, the control that you can get with a low seat makes all the difference. Now this sort of stuff, a rigid bike's not going to compete with, because the saddle is not affecting me and the bike just glides across the surface. You've got loads of traction, it's just so fast. Can a rigid bike be quicker than this? I'm not sure it can, even for the benefits of the riding position. Okay, so now we've seen both setups in different areas, but this really is where suspension comes in. And there's no question that riding rooty, rough terrain can be done better on a suspension bike. Now, I know some purists will say, yeah, okay, it's down to line choice, but let's be realistic about this. Suspension enables you to cover ground much more efficiently. Rigid bike certainly does climb nicely, but you most definitely have to consider your line choice. And this is in the bone dry. If this is in the wet, it would be a completely different thing. Okay then, observations so far. I've ridden both the bikes on a variety of different trails, some of which, granted, you shouldn't really be riding on these sorts of bikes, not their intention. But that said, you know, they both dealt with it really well in completely different ways. The rigid bike with a dropper out of the way, I just felt like it was faster everywhere, but that's probably because I felt every single bump and I was out of control most of the time. Thankfully, saddle out of the way makes a significant difference. Opposite could be said though of the full suspension bike. You're really desensitised to the bumps by comparison to the rigid bike, but I felt so nervous and cautious of the saddle constantly being underneath me. But as soon as things opened up a bit more, and there's not much in the way of sort of bumps and whoops and stuff, full suspension bike just covers ground so much faster. And the same could be said, you know, we did a little bit of climbing stuff and some rooty stuff. The rigid bike is really difficult in the dry on routes, going up and down, let alone in the wet. Full suspension bike, you've got traction, you've got comfort, you've got everything. But now what we're going to do is put both the bikes on a trail, a blue graded trail that's quite appropriate for both of them. I'm going to ride the entire descent, I'm going to time it on both bikes. Now this will be really interesting because there's a variety of different things on here. There's hard berms, there's turns, there's some drops and jumps and stuff on here, and there's also some whoops. The whoops and all that sort of stuff, that is going to feel horrendous with the saddle up. But the rest of the trail I think is going to feel quite bad on this bike because it's so chattery. And honestly at this stage, I don't know which one's going to be quicker. Let's find out. Okay, full suspension bike, rigid seat post. Timer on, let's go. So this is a blue rated descent. It's pretty slippy in places, so got to watch out. Can't go too hot, but I'm going to rely on the suspension of the bike to keep me in control. I say that, and I've got these whoops to contend with. And they make things really quite difficult because you can't get your body weight in a position to really control the bike. There's some of those I can free jump, but the bigger one, like that, are really quite difficult. But I can get the power down in between, which I think I'm going to struggle with on the other bike. Whew. Tell you what, the trail surface is so dry and so loose. It's definitely making things. Whoa. There. Now it's going to be interesting to see what the time is on the other bike. Fully rigid bike with a dropper post now. Let's see how much difference this makes. Okay, again, got to be careful because it's mega slippy and I've got no suspension to help me. But I have got the ability to change my weight around on the bike a bit more, which then you feel so much nicer. Yeah. But a bit more in control than I did on the other bike. Okay, this is hard work on the chattery stuff, that's for sure. Just trying to focus and not crash there. I'm completely honest, it is so slippery. Okay then, how has today gone? Well, I've got some interesting results to tell you about, but before we get there, let's just talk about my experience of riding the two bikes. Now, as I explained at the beginning of the video, I grew up riding rigid bikes, and there was no such thing as disc brakes even, let alone dropper posts. So I'm more than familiar with this, but it did take me a bit to get used to it. But the bigger 29-inch wheels from what I grew up riding, that definitely irons out some stuff. But that said, had an absolute drilling today on my hands, really rattled myself. I've loved riding this over the full suspension bike with the saddle down because I can maneuver the bike around and do what I want with it. With the full suspension bike, I very much felt like a passenger, and that's just not the way I like to ride. However, there's just simply no arguing with full suspension when it comes to covering ground. It just irons out the bumps, enables you to brake where you need to brake. You can pedal over things like roots and adverse terrain. It's just, full suspension is simply incredible. But also, as I explained in the video, you don't need all of this technology to go and have fun on mountain bikes. You just need a basic mountain bike and some woods. Okay then, timings. Now, this was quite interesting. I rode the blue descent here in the Forest of Dean, set off on the full suspension Lux first. And as I was riding, I thought, do you know what? I'm not sure I can ride it too much faster, at least in the turns, because of the amount of traction on offer. And the thing I felt that was limiting me was the whoops, because I literally couldn't ride them any faster without getting airborne and kicked out the bum. So I rode it at a speed I felt comfortable I could sustain, got to the bottom. 2:57 was my time on that bike. By the time I got my hand off the bars, managed to stop the timer. But here's the interesting thing. Albeit, saddle down, I was sliding around loads more, but as soon as I got to the whoops, because of the fact I could let the bike move around underneath me, I felt I could generate speed through there. And that is everything to me in the way that I like to ride. I like to be in control of what I'm doing with the bike. I don't want to be a passenger like I was riding with the Lux there. And as a result, I ended up with 250. 7 seconds quicker, even though I felt like I was out of control more on that bike for sliding around. It just goes to show what you can do when you manipulate the bike around underneath you. I'm really pleased that the bike with no suspension and the dropper post won, because as I said at the beginning of the video, I'm a huge fan of the dropper post. Yeah, sure, you can lower your seat and you can get the same effect. No problem at all. I'm not suggesting everyone goes out and buys a dropper post. But the fact is, if you want to get out on the trails and get the most from your bike without having to stop and faff around with that, a dropper post can really significantly help that, even over suspension, or at least in the test that I did today. What I love to get from a bike is moving it around. That's the thing that I love, and therefore, I'm going to go with that as my favourite choice today, and it was the fastest choice, although I feel like I've been beaten up by it. But that is something you can get used to. But what I would love to know is if you had the choice between two setups, a full suspension bike with a rigid seat post, or a rigid bike with a dropper post, what would your choice be and why? I'd love to know. Please get involved in the comments. Thanks for watching, and thanks for calling me out and making me do this, because it's actually been a good day out riding. Cheers, see you in another video soon.